Then Kyiv, strengthened by EU loans, will begin to dictate its own terms, according to the grim prediction of an ultra-nationalist Russian military blogger, due to the dramatic situation of Russia's state finances. This, while Russia is suffering from a depletion of resources among its soldiers because its recruitment numbers continue to decline. Mobilization would then, of course, be necessary, but Medvedev himself calls mobilization destabilizing and could be right about that. And all this while the Telegram founder Pavel Durov is possibly threatening the Russian military right now. At least that's what a Russian Milblogger believes. All that and everything happening along the front is covered in this Ukraine war situation report. Holy moly, now save the most at Holy with my code. The attacks on Wildberries warehouses are continuing. This time, in this example, Wildberries itself reports that its warehouses in Penza and in Udmurtia were hit. Similarly, in Volgograd, a refinery and another Wildberries warehouse were hit and set on fire. More and more Wildberries warehouses are being hit, and some have already been destroyed. Wildberries is responding by apparently planning to set up a logistics center in Kazakhstan. Of course, if the logistics center is on the other side of the border, then it will be safe from Ukrainian attacks, and at least the region near the border will be able to be supplied from there. The Russian government is reportedly considering supporting Wildberries, Reuters reports. The government is considering tax breaks and whether the state-owned VTB bank, which owns 5% of Wildberries, will support Wildberries. I will now quote from the article. Dennis Stillerman, co-founder and chief designer of Firepoint, described Wildberries in an interview on the 27th July. In an interview published on July 27, he called it the largest borrower in Russia and explained that its collapse would lead to the collapse of a large number of banks, including VTB. And it's important here that I give the full quote, because it shows us how he puts it into context and looks at such a report, which sounds very dramatic, in a different light. It continues. Wildberries reported debts of 830 billion rubles, which is about 10.6 billion US dollars, according to Russian accounting standards, which is significantly lower than the debts of some of the largest Russian companies in the energy and industrial sectors. The company stated that the debt calculated according to international standards is at a comfortable level, below twice the earnings before interest, taxes, and depreciation, but did not provide any specific figures. So the situation is probably not that bad after all, especially for the Russian banks, unless Wildberries goes under, which of course becomes more likely with each passing day due to the ongoing attacks. But do you know why Wildberries is being targeted? Because Ukraine can simply find out where the warehouses are. You yourself may not be threatened by the Ukrainians, but if you don't want your data to be so easy to find, then you should definitely use today's sponsor. If you hate unwanted emails and calls as much as I do, today's video sponsor can help you. Incogni has a very simple business model. For a small fee, our data is deleted from the internet. There are tons of free offers on the internet that we accept, even though we know the saying, if we don't pay for the product, we are the product. All these websites and apps either show us ads or collect our personal data and sell it to data brokers. That's not just our email addresses and names, but often also our date of birth, home addresses, and buying or surfing behavior. Every search query, every product you look at can ultimately be tracked. These data can then be used for spam, but also by companies when it comes to insurance premiums or loans. Insurance can become more expensive. Loans can be denied because due to visiting certain websites or making specific searches on the internet, you are considered unreliable or careless. Incogni is here to prevent that. Basically, it makes sure that we don't have to pay all the costs for what we use for free on the internet. You sign up, give the company permission to act on your behalf, and then they get to work deleting your data. I can track the progress directly, and every time I check, I get confirmation of more deleted entries. If the brokers cause any problems, Incogni keeps at it until my data is gone. Month after month, they continue to protect my privacy. If you want to take back your privacy too, you'll find the link in the description. By doing so, you not only support the channel, but you also get a 60% discount when you use my link. I now have an annual subscription myself to make sure my data stays deleted. At the same time, I'm grateful that you're supporting the channel. But let's get back to the video. In addition to the attack on the refinery in Volgograd, the attacks on oil infrastructure are of course continuing elsewhere as well. For example, the oil terminal in Taman was hit, and firms once again show strong raging fires. In attacks on refineries, Ukraine is focusing on components that are especially hard to replace, reports the Financial Times. Also, that the Ukrainians specifically consulted with industry experts on how to cause the maximum amount of damage, not only to make something burn well, but to ensure the hardest to replace parts are destroyed. And this was successful enough that even the Financial Times reported that 30% of the effective refinery capacity has now been shut down, and 45% of the nominal capacity in Russia. Russia itself is also attacking Ukraine. For example, there was a major attack by the Russians on the night of July 30th, with 284 drones and 74 rockets and cruise missiles. 4 Zircon missiles were used in the attack. These are supposedly hypersonic glide vehicles. In addition, 9 Iskander-M or KN-23 missiles for the first time in a year. A missile from North Korea was used again. In addition, 61 caliber and KH-101 cruise missiles. Ukraine says it shot down 265 out of 284 drones. That's 93% 1 out of 13 missiles. That's 8%. And 54 out of 61 cruise missiles, 89%. There were numerous civilian deaths in the attacks. And in addition, a KH-101 cruise missile flew into Poland, and it impacted there. However, it hit an open field, so there were no casualties. Ukraine lost another F-16 while trying to intercept the attacking missiles. And this time, the pilot was able to eject. The exact reason this time is unknown. In the past, there have been cases where pilots flew into the debris cloud. I've explained elsewhere that this is one of the major risks when missiles are shot down with the aircraft's cannon, that the aircraft is relatively close to the exploding target, and accordingly, it can fly into the debris cloud, which then means that the engine can fail. Zelensky requested 300 PAC-3 missiles in the U.S. for the winter. This was not to be expected due to the low stocks caused by the Iran war. According to CSCS, the U.S. only has about 800 of them left, and further hostilities with Iran may be coming. Zelensky is now requesting in return the activation of Starlink in Russia, so that the launch vehicles can be hunted more effectively. Starlink is still obviously not available in Russia. For Ukraine, for their attacks. And Zelensky is now trying to convince the US to allow Starlink for Ukrainian weapons, so that, for example, they can destroy the Iskander launchers with the rockets on board, even before they launch attacks on Ukraine. The Russians are not only successful in killing civilians with their attacks, but of course they are also hitting military targets. So here, it's obviously an ammunition depot in the city of Khmelnytsky. I definitely messed it up, Mel. Khmelnytsky. Something like that. Forgive me. Forgive my terrible pronunciation. But an ammunition depot was hit here, and it's reported that a drone factory in Kiev was also hit. Of course, that's not the only success. But Ukrainian wartime censorship works relatively well in keeping successful attacks on military targets secret by the Russians, which of course keep happening. It's by no means only the Ukrainians who hit Russian factories and Russian depots. The Russians also managed to do this again and again. We move on to the developments along the front, and there, from Veliki Burluk, we have the Russian Milblogger Ryba. They report that it is the Russian intention to encircle and envelop the north of Kharkiv Oblast. That means, if we look at this on the map, they say the attacks here in this direction are coordinated with attacks in this direction. Mind you, Ryba already attributes Beliki Kolodjas to the Russians. That was the place where this 6-meter-tall Russian was identified in the pictures, which, logically, AI recognized.
Auf den Bildern erkannt wurde, was logischerweise KI war.
But basically, it is said there that they plan to encircle the Ukrainians in this area here. In the medium term, that might be an option, but without a war of movement, it will happen in such a way that the Ukrainians can withdraw if they want to. So the idea that it could happen so quickly that the Ukrainians are surprised, encircled, and especially cut off is actually completely unrealistic. In general, we currently have about 25 kilometers between the two sides here. And that means that if the attacks from both sides continue and go deeper, mind you, I'm not talking about the outermost tips here, but when the two pincers get closer together. Then, of course, there will be medium-term problems for the Ukrainians regarding rotation and supplies. The narrower the corridor, the more difficult both will be. And that could, of course, force a retreat in the medium term. And fittingly, the Ukrainian report says that Rubicon, which is Russia's elite drone unit, is now active on exactly these two axes. It was then reported that Rubicon is active here and here, which would support Ryba's theory. If we move on to Borova, we have the next report there. This is the area where I have repeatedly reported Ukrainian counterattacks. This is again confirmed by a Russian Milblogger. However, it is not apparent that these attacks have had any significant success here, at least not according to the reports of the Russian Milblogger. Further south towards Lyman, we continue to see high Russian activity. The Russians are of course trying to reach the Siversky Donets, and from there threaten Sloviansk from the northeast. In Lyman, Russian infiltration is taking place, but the city is still definitely contested. I can't say what percentage is controlled by each side, but the Ukrainians, from everything I can see, still have a significant presence inside Lyman. So Lyman has not fallen so far, even though there have repeatedly been geolocations from the town itself. Further south towards Sloviansk, I don't have any relevant reports. Towards Kostiantynivka, we have Ryba again, who report that the Ukrainians are infiltrating Drova Balka, meaning they are attacking. And that's here on the western flank of the attack on Kostiantynivka. Here, from the Russian perspective, attacks are obviously supposed to be carried out to put pressure on the Russians inside Kostiantynivka. As for Kostiantynivka itself, we have a Ukrainian source here who says, "We are constantly being attacked by KABs. Those are the glide bombs. They simply destroy simple positions with air bombs. That's the only thing the Russians are still having success with, and that's a big problem for us." To what extent that really is the only thing, of course, is debatable. But we have confirmation from the Ukrainian side that the glide bombs are again or still a big problem. And if we don't have any reports from other relevant parts of the front, we can go straight to discussing the overall strategic situation. Ukrainian attacks are, of course, still being carried out against substations and air defenses, that's clear. But since the Battle of Avdiivka at the end of 2023, glide bombs have become a very important tool for the Russian advance. Because of its long-range air-to-air missiles, especially the R-37, and its drastic technical and numerical superiority, Russia can keep Ukrainian fighter jets at a distance and at low altitude. Because in fact, the modern Sukhoi 35S are better than what Ukraine is getting in F-16S and Mirage 2000S, and they're definitely better than the old Sukhoi 27s and MiG-29s that Ukraine still has, both in terms of radar performance and in terms of long-range air combat weapons. That means the Ukrainians have no effective way to fight the aircraft dropping the glide bombs. Individual shootdowns, like the recent shootdown by an F-16, don't fundamentally change that, because the Ukrainians are kept at very low altitude and just beyond the front by Russian air defenses and by Russian fighter jets, which can fire at them with long-range R-37M missiles. However, by weakening Russian air defense capabilities now, smaller windows could theoretically open up here in the medium term, although the threat from Russian long-range air-to-air missiles will of course remain. A real improvement in the situation can only be expected when Ukraine has Meteor air-to-air missiles. Those will probably come with the Gripen. This can be expected in about 1.5 years at the earliest. From that point on, the Russians will be less able to operate over the front as easily as they have so far. However, we have to be clear here. Russia is already working on glide bombs with auxiliary propulsion, usually a cheap jet engine, in order to increase the range. And that is supposed to increase the range to up to 200 kilometers in the medium term. The Meteor will then help the Ukrainians to better protect the rear area by preventing Russian aircraft carrying glide bombs from flying close to the front, because they would then be threatened by the Meteor there. But of course, the Russians can still drop the glide bombs from a great distance from the front, if it's just about directly supporting the front. The Meteor won't really make a difference when it comes to front positions. Front positions will still be vulnerable to attacks by extended-range glide bombs. That's at least to be expected. In addition, we have developments in the leadership of the Ukrainian military. The new commander-in-chief, Netrapati, has dismissed the chief of staff and the deputy commander of the ground forces. He has also dismissed the commander of the logistics forces. Critics accuse him of having supplied units loyal to Syrskyi and having denied supplies to units that were not considered loyal to Syrskyi. As I said, I can't say how true that is, but he has now been dismissed. In addition, the position of the commander of the artillery and rocket forces in the general staff, where he oversaw long-range attacks, has also been terminated, so there are changes here as well. At the same time, and this is interesting, a human rights activist has been appointed by the cabinet as deputy defense minister. Here, it's supposed to be about protection, the protection of human lives, because that's been a long-standing issue for Ukrainians, that they have no rotation of soldiers, and the soldiers who have been fighting since 2022, since February 2022, and are still healthy. They still have to fight since no rotation is happening, and apparently, there is supposed to be a greater focus on making sure that the population in the country gets the impression that more concern is being shown for people's lives. As for CE generation, we have Medvedev, who says that the rumors about a mobilization are an attempt to destabilize things. What's interesting here is the point that a mobilization is seen as destabilizing by Medvedev, and he could be right about that, because at least there are reports that rents in Georgia are already rising again, since Russians are leaving their country and moving to Georgia in anticipation of a mobilization. And of course, these are people who are then no longer available for the military, but who may also no longer be available as taxpayers and workers within Russia, because not everyone will be a remote worker who continues to work for their Russian company from Georgia. The officer at the front, the Russian military blogger, evaluates the recruitment, which would be necessary to avoid mobilization, as follows. The lack of equipment is one half of the equation. The other half is the people, and here the picture is even more worrying. Let's calculate openly and without political considerations. In 2023, about 540,000 contract soldiers were recruited into the army. In 2024, it was already 440,000, so 100,000 less. In 2025, the number of recruits dropped to 400,000. The forecast for 2026, based on Medvedev's own quarterly figures, is in the range of 320,000 soldiers. A decrease of 35 to 40% within 3 years is not a fluctuation, but an exhaustion of resources. Financial incentives, one-time payments, and everything that still worked in 2023 and 2024 no longer attract the target group. Those who were willing to leave for money have already left. The ones who remain are weighing the risks soberly. Despite everything, an important point remains, though these are poor prospects for the Russians. Here is what Zelensky himself says. Namely, that Russia would have recruited 221,000 men by the end of July and lost 225,500. So even from the Ukrainian leadership side, it is said that the Russians lost only about 4,500 more men in the first half of the year than they recruited. Despite all the quite accurate negative reports about the Russian personnel situation, you still have to keep this in perspective. Because in the end, if we want to believe Zelensky himself, it was only about 4,500 more men than the Russians were able to recruit in the first 6.5 months. Then we have news that shouldn't really come as a surprise. Namely, Trump is no longer sure whether Ukraine is allowed to produce the Patriot under license. I had expressed my doubts from the very beginning about whether that was even conceivable. Because the PAC-3, that's the missile the Ukrainians need to shoot down ballistic missiles, even in Japan, it has to be assembled by US personnel. Parts of it are so secret that they don't even want the Japanese, their close and loyal ally, to handle certain components during production. Even there, US workers are on site. From the very beginning, I had my doubts that something like this could happen in a country at war, where there is still some Russian infiltration without American staff. Of course, it's also true that American workers in Ukraine are not very likely to be at locations where missile attacks are expected. At the same time, however, Lockheed Martin announced that by 2030 they are planning to produce 2,000 PAC-3 units per year through a contract worth $58 billion that the US Department of Defense has signed with Lockheed Martin. This is not only to allow for large-scale orders, but also to enable an expansion of production capacity. So in just 4 years, 2,000 PAC-3 missiles are supposed to be produced per month. As for the political aspect, Russia has put Pavel Durov on a wanted list. I think that's the wrong one. This is exactly it. Pavel Durov was put on a wanted list for terrorism, among other reasons, because he still allows Ukrainians, especially Ukrainian intelligence services and so on, to use Telegram. And from the perspective of the Russian government, he would therefore be allowing terrorism on Telegram. However, it is suspected that this is being used to put pressure on him to give the FSB more access. On the other hand, he himself writes that the Russian authorities apparently don't seem to be entirely clear about who is allowed to block access to the internet for whom. And here too, the officer at the front comments sarcastically, saying that Pavel Durov has dropped a hint, and this hint sounds like an alarm signal. He is actually able to block access to Telegram in the area of the Special Operations Zone, that is, the war zone, and in the border regions. This is not just a technical measure, it's a blow to the war zone's nervous system. Without communication, without information exchange, without coordinates, we will be blind and deaf. This will not just be a means of pressure, it will undermine the operational readiness of all units. It will become a harbinger of catastrophe, defeat, and chaos. And in the Kremlin, you help Durov get labeled. You pin the label of terrorist on Durov, instead of thinking about the consequences. The pensioners in power, who have lost touch with reality, do not fear the enemy, but their own people. They fear that massive resistance against the new mobilization could arise through Telegram. And that's exactly the suspicion that's not only being expressed officially at the front, but in many places, that this is the preparation to simply be able to shut down Telegram in the event of a mobilization, because Durov didn't do what they wanted, so that they can prevent the coordination of resistance against the mobilization. At the same time, Maxim Kalashnikov says that because of its budget deficit, Russia only has bad options left. The deficit of the federal budget of the Russian Federation has reached a record value of 8,681 billion rubles. I would like to remind you that the planned deficit was initially 3.8 trillion per year. Now it's 8.6 or 8.7 trillion. It had earlier been quietly raised to 4.7 trillion. And this doesn't even take into account the 1.5 trillion deficit of the regional budgets and the deficit of the social fund. So if nothing is done, the state treasury's revenues will dry up in November 2026. To prevent the state finances from collapsing, extremely serious and unpopular decisions must be made. Either 8 trillion rubles must be printed and the ruble devalued, filling the state treasury with nominal revenues that have lost their value. Or a portion of citizens' bank deposits must be forcibly converted into government bonds. Or a portion of the Russian Federation's gold reserves must be sold, about 800 tons out of a total of 2,280 tons. Each option brings its own dangers. If they start printing money and devalue the currency, there could be a run on the banks by savers, leading to a dangerous banking crisis. Containing the panic would cause significant costs, and the savings of those fighting as contract soldiers in the war would lose value. The forced use of bank deposits would be a severe political blow to the government, and also a blow to those very contract soldiers who are fighting in the war. Selling a third of the gold reserves carries the risk of driving down global gold prices and losing a third of the untouchable reserves. In short, our high society has gotten caught in a bind. Now their zigzag maneuvers make sense. The bitter war against Telegram and the begging Trump for Anchorage-style negotiations. Because if things continue like this, Sloviansk and Kramatorsk might be captured. But after that, the country's economy could collapse. After that, not only Sloviansk and Kramatorsk could be lost. Beijing will not grant a rescue loan of $100 to $150 billion. And if the economy collapses, it will be impossible to keep fighting. Then Kyiv, strengthened by EU loans, will start to dictate its terms. If our authorities, on the other hand, try to call up 100,000 reservists, the budget deficit would suddenly increase by at least 2 trillion. In short, I don't exactly envy our leadership right now. And that's it for today's Situation Report. Tomorrow at 8 p.m., German time is the next live stream with a situation report on the Ukraine war and a subsequent Q&A session. Of course, I would be happy to see you there. If you're new here, I'd like to invite you to subscribe to the channel and click the bell. If you enjoyed it, give it a thumbs up, leave a comment. You know the usual drill. That's all from my side for now. Thank you for your attention. See you soon. Thanks also to the supporters on Patreon as well as here on YouTube. Special thanks to Lieutenant Colonel Mahamori and to Lieutenant Robert Phil, Immelkopf, Floja, Capri, Burton Ment, Lichtschatter, NTX, Malermeister, Nagel, Markus F., Alex Rosenthal, Matt Best, Mütter 1000 Janescu, Cunningham, Oistress, Finn, 5 Farb, Flecktarn, Jans vom Eck, Uwe du Fressne, Nickname to Bib, Carsten Schulz, Tequila 42. Thank you very much. Without you, this wouldn't be possible.